Much of what we know about how Roman military sites were laid out, and what they were called, comes from two authors. Polybius, writing in the mid-2nd century BCE, gives the earliest surviving account of a marching camp. Nearly 3 centuries later, in Trajan's reign, the surveyor known as Hyginus Grammaticus composed a technical handbook on planning camps and fortifications that could house every kind of unit an officer might encounter. Despite the gap in time, their descriptions broadly agree, the main differences reflecting the distinct needs of temporary halts in the field versus permanent garrisons. Excavation and aerial survey, especially in Britain, have shown that the principles set out by these writers shaped forts and fortresses from the late Republic well into the 3rd century CE. On campaign, armies threw up nightly marching camps for protection, and once a region had been taken, they established a chain of turf and timber forts spaced about a day's march apart. In Britain, this phase ran until the mid-80s CE. Before permanent legionary bases were chosen, legions also built seasonal strongholds, summer bases called castra aestiva, and winter quarters called castra hiberna. As imperial expansion slowed, these places hardened into permanent installations. They kept the basic defensive logic of the marching camp, but replaced the shallow ditch and palisade with heavier works. 2 or more V-shaped ditches and an earthen or turfed rampart crowned by a timber parapet. 4 gateways remained, now shielded by towers, with additional towers at the corners and at intervals along the walls. No single blueprint fits every Roman fortress, fort, or marching camp. Although the fortress plan was notionally standardized, close study shows wide variation from site to site and even within the same building types. Broad patterns still emerge. Before Domitian, permanent legionary fortresses could house 2 legions. Under Domitian, they were reduced to about 20 to 25 hectares for a single legion, and there were smaller versions of roughly 10 to 15 hectares used for a full legion or a group of cohorts, sometimes with auxiliaries, during a campaign. Modern archaeologists call these smaller campaign bases vexillation fortresses. Day-to-day control of the provinces rested on the auxiliary fort of about 1 to 5 hectares, a permanent base for a non-citizen unit planned as a scaled-down fortress. Auxiliary forts built between about 80 and 125 CE were ringed by an earthen rampart cased in timber or turf, founded on a log bed or stone footing, topped with a split timber breastwork or with woven hurdles, and fronted by 1 or more V-shaped ditches. 4 gateways pierced the rampart, each protected by a timber tower over the passage, or flanked by towers to either side. More towers, set within the rampart, stood at the angles and at regular intervals. Along Hadrian's wall, by contrast, forts were faced entirely in stone, with stone curtain walls, towers, and gatehouses. Tacitus called the fort the soldier's hearth and home, capturing its dual purpose: a secure, reasonably comfortable base and a springboard for operations. It was never meant to be a last-stand citadel. In war, the garrison marched out to fight at close quarters. In quieter times, they patrolled deep beyond the frontier, supporting allies or conducting punitive expeditions. Smaller still were fortlets of about 1 hectare, placed between larger sites, along roads, or at river crossings, usually housing a century or a little more from an auxiliary cohort. A fortlet had a single gateway with a tower above and 1 or 2 outer ditches. With their conspicuous towers, they served to watch and to be seen. To protect rural populations in Mauritania Caesariensis, Commodus ordered new watchtowers and repairs to old ones built by his soldiers. Such towers, typically 3 or 4 meters square at the base and at least 2 stories high, often lacked full barrack blocks. A small team of 8 men, one contubernium, likely manned them within a light rampart and a single or double ditch strung out along roads and rivers to monitor movement. As Josephus notes, Roman forces entering hostile country began by throwing up a camp. Marching camps were overnight stops for units in the field. Each had a shallow ditch and a low bank made from the excavated soil, about 1.5 meters high, topped with a palisade assembled from the 2 wooden stakes each soldier carried, the pila muralia. Rather than ramming a single stake into the ground, current thinking is that soldiers lashed 3 together to make large, 3-footed barriers that bit into the soil like caltrops. Gateways had no doors. Sentries guarded them. To cover the openings, troops built an outwork called a titulus, a detached mound and ditch set several meters in front, or extended the rampart in a curved projection called a clavicula, which could bend outward or inward to force attackers into a killing zone. Simple as they were, these measures gave men sleeping under canvas a reliable shield against surprise. Sextus Julius Frontinus, the governor of Britannia around AD 73 to 78, and a noted engineer, left several technical works. In one, he praises the maxim of Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, the hard-driving commander famous for realistic drills, who said that the pick was the weapon with which to defeat the enemy. He was pointing to the army's proven skill at throwing up its own fortified camps. Recruits had to be taught these field works from scratch, and seasoned soldiers needed regular practice to keep standards high. Britain yields the empire's largest cluster of practice camps, most of them about 30.5 meters on a side. They tend to sit a mile or 2 from a fort and near a Roman road. Here, troops rehearsed the building of marching camps, especially the trickiest parts, such as corners and gateways. Tacitus remarked that Britain became a province only gradually. Even 8 decades after the Claudian invasion, there was no true northern frontier to match the Rhine, Danube, or Euphrates. By Trajan's reign, the Staingate Road from Corbridge to Carlisle marked the outer limit of occupation, but it did not form a frontier system. Since the time of Claudius, security in the north had rested on a treaty with Cartimandua, queen of the Brigantes. In AD 69, her consort Venutius overthrew her, and relations with Rome collapsed. As Tacitus put it with bitter economy, the kingdom went to Venutius, and the war to us. During Rome's civil strife, the governor Marcus Vettius Bolanus could do little beyond extracting the client queen. There are hints he managed more than Tacitus admits, though not the Caledonian exploits a contemporary poet fancifully ascribed to him. His successor Quintus Petilius Carialis renewed the offensive in Brigantian country, winning bloody battles after campaigning widely. The work of earlier energetic governors mattered, yet lasting pacification of the north belongs above all to Gnaeus Julius Agricola, Tacitus's father-in-law and governor for 7 years, from AD 77 or 78 to 83 or 84. Agricola knew Britain's troubles firsthand, having served as a military tribune during the Boudiccan revolt and later as legate of the 20th Valeria Victrix. Hadrian's wall did not arise in a vacuum. Hadrian generally favored fixed limits for the empire, yet a fresh outbreak in northern Britain at the start of his reign may have forced the issue. A tombstone from Ferentinum names Titus Pontius Sabinus, once chief centurion of the 3rd Augusta, who commanded detachments of the 7th Gemina, the 8th Augusta, and the 22nd Primigenia on an expedition to Britain. Since the inscription records decorations from the deified Trajan, the expedition likely fell in Trajan's last years or under Hadrian. Another stone commemorates Gaius Julius Carus, prefect of the 2nd Asturian cohort, who was decorated for the British War before transferring to Egypt as a tribune of the Third Cyrenaica. A late 4th century source lists a British revolt among the troubles that greeted the new emperor, saying the Britons could not be kept under Roman control. Decades later, Marcus Cornelius Fronto consoled Marcus Aurelius over losses in Parthia by recalling how many soldiers had been killed under Hadrian by the Jews and how many by the Britons. A fragmentary stone from Chesterholm memorializes Titus Annius, a legionary centurion acting as commander of the first cohort of Tungrians, who was killed in the fighting, very likely in the area where Hadrian soon ordered the Tyne-Solway line. As for causes, a Vindolanda writing tablet lays bare the sort of contempt that could fuel resentment. It sneers at the nasty little Brits and mocks the naked Britons' fighting ability. The memorandum likely refers to Britons recruited into irregular units known as numeri. An inscription for the cavalry prefect Titus Haterius Nepos shows him conducting a census of Britons in Annandale, just across the Solway, perhaps to conscript them into numeri for the upper German frontier, where 10 such British units are attested about the time the insulting letter was written. The same Nepos corresponded with Flavius Genialis, prefect at Chesterholm of the first cohort of Tungrians, and asked him to come to Corbridge, where Nepos was probably stationed. Tacitus notes that Britons had already been serving in the army since Domitian's day, and he puts into the mouth of Calgacus at Mons Graupius a complaint about forced levies that raised units in Britain for service overseas. Britannia appears on coins for the first time under Hadrian. One bronze coin of AD 119 shows her in military dress and apparently dejected, often read as an allusion to the rebels crushed by Quintus Pompeius Falco, Trajan's governor who had remained in the province. Hadrian himself arrived in AD 122 and, in the words of his biographer, set many things in order and was the first to build a wall 80 miles long to divide Romans from barbarians. The line chosen runs a little north of the Staingate forts. Agricola had laid that road to link Corbridge on the eastern artery from York with Carlisle on the western route from Chester. Although forts existed beyond Carlisle and to the east of Corbridge, there was no continuous barrier across the Tyne-Solway Isthmus before the wall. 2 inscription fragments reused in a church at Jarrow neatly sum up the wall's origin and Hadrian's role. They hail the Emperor Trajan Hadrian Augustus, who, once divine command had laid on him the duty to keep the empire within its bounds, and once the barbarians had been scattered and Britannia recovered, added an 80-mile frontier between the 2 shores of the ocean. They add that the provincial army built the wall under the direction of Aulus Platorius Nepos, the emperor's propraetorian legate. Hadrian had served as a military tribune on the Danube and Rhine, and later governed Syria, so he knew frontier defense firsthand. He also loved building. His reign opened with trouble in northern Britain, almost certainly stirred up by the Brigantes, with help from groups across the Solway. Quintus Pompeius Falco crushed the revolt, but Roman losses were heavy. Hadrian's visit to the island formed part of a grand inspection tour to tighten the frontiers, overhaul training, enforce discipline, and stamp out abuses in the ranks. Roman contempt toward the Britons, compulsory recruiting, and the backlash it provoked all fed into his order to create the Tyne-Solway frontier. Hadrian's wall combined 4 continuous elements: the curtain wall itself, a great ditch, a service road known as the Military Way, and the rear earthwork now called the Vallum. Woven into this system were Milecastles, turrets, and forts to house the garrison. Beyond it stood outpost forts to the north, and down the Cumbrian coast a line of forts, fortlets, and watchtowers extended the defense. The original plan set the wall at 76 Roman miles, roughly 70 modern miles, along the north rim of the Tyne Gap, from Newcastle upon Tyne, where a bridge honored the emperor with the name Ponce Aelius, to the crossing of the river Irthing. The first 45 Roman miles, about 41 modern miles, were to be stone, built 3 meters wide and perhaps 4.5 meters high to the walkway. The remaining 31 Roman miles, about 29 modern miles, would be of turf blocks nearly 6 meters thick at the base, a tried material chosen in the West to speed the work. Structural clues show a major rethink in what is usually taken as the second full building season, around AD 124. Some stretches, such as the run between Turret 39A and Turret 39B, were set out for a full-width stone wall, but finished only a little over 2 meters thick. Archaeologists call the planned version the broad wall and the narrowed version the narrow wall. The same pattern appears at features like Milecastle 48 at Poltross Burn and Turret 48A at Willowford East, where foundations anticipate a broader curtain than the one actually built. Before the project ended, the army decided to plant forts directly on the line and to accelerate construction by narrowing the standard stone thickness from 3 meters to either 2 1/3 meters or 1 4/5 meters. By the time this order went out, all the Milecastles between the North Tyne and the Irthing and most of the turrets were already standing, while the curtain itself lagged behind. Soon after the fort decision, and while those forts were still going up, planners added a rear earthwork behind the wall. More changes followed. The line was extended down the Tyne from Newcastle to the fort at Wallsend in the narrower gauge without a vallum, raising the total length to 80 Roman miles, close to 74 modern miles. A new fort at Carrawburgh filled the long gap between Chesters and Housesteads, and another at Drumburg bridged the space between Burgby Sands and Bowness on Solway. Part of the western turf wall, from Milecastle 49 at Harrow's Scar to Milecastle 54 at Randylands, was rebuilt as a narrow-gauge stone curtain. After the wall was reoccupied in the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the remaining turf sections were replaced in stone, and the military way was completed. Both broad and narrow wall versions stood on rough slab foundations set in puddled clay. Builders used mostly limestone, dressing blocks with roughly squared faces so they could lay them in straight, regular courses that masons would call coursed rubble. Each facing block carried a tapered tail keyed into the core to keep the face from peeling away. At intervals, a flat tie course of slabs bound the faces into the core and leveled the bed for the next lifts. Clay formed the bulk of the core with rubble as infill. Mortar was applied sparingly, usually just to point the outer faces. The usual sequence was to lay 1 or 2 courses of facing stone, pack in clay and rubble, then add more courses and more core in alternating lifts. In at least some places, the finished curtain was plastered and lime-washed to present a bright, unified front. The turf wall was built from turf blocks, laid on a base of coursed turf, 3 or 4 layers deep, though in some stretches the base was made of rounded cobbles. Vegetius in Book 3, Chapter 8, gives an ideal block size of 1.5 by 1/2 a Roman foot, which converts to 444 by 296 by 148 millimeters, though it is unclear whether the wall's builders followed that guideline. The little that survives suggests a steeply sloped outer face and a rear face that rose vertically at first and then continued at a steep angle. Its height matched that of the stone curtain, and it likely carried a wattle parapet that screened the wall-top walk. There was a protected walkway along the crest for patrols, as hinted by the Rudge Cup, but the wall's narrow width means it should not be imagined as a continuous fighting platform. Its elevation chiefly provided wide visibility, including a clear view down into the ditch immediately in front. North of the wall, a ditch was cut close to the outer face, except where the line rides the crest of natural scarps, for example along the high ground from turret 33A at Sewing Shields to turret 45B at Walltown. The strip between wall and ditch, the berm, was rarely less than 5.9 meters wide on the stone curtain and only about 1.83 meters on the turf section. This spacing both reduced the chance of the wall slipping into the ditch and guarded against undermining if the ditch sides eroded. Like most Roman military earthworks, the ditch had a V-shaped profile, with both inner and outer slopes set about 30 degrees off vertical. In places, there is evidence of a square-cut cleaning channel at the bottom, often called an ankle breaker. Dimensions vary along the line, but a typical top width is 9 to 12 meters and a depth of roughly 2.66 to 2.96 meters. Spoil from the excavation was thrown to the north to form a broad glossus that raised the outer lip and then tapered gently so as not to give cover to an approaching enemy. Where forts were later planted astride the wall, lengths of the ditch were backfilled, as at Burdaswald. Another linear feature of the Tyne to Solway system was a service road running roughly parallel to the wall on the south side. This military way was not part of the first Hadrianic scheme, as it sometimes rides on or crosses the north mound of the rear earthwork, but the establishment of permanent garrisons made rapid communication essential. Spur roads have been identified linking the military way to forts, Milecastles, and turrets, showing its role as the frontier's internal artery. The road appears to have been added when the wall was reoccupied, perhaps reflecting lessons learned on the Antonine frontier. Surviving stretches show a standard Roman build about 5.4 to 5.9 meters wide, with a strong camber and side ditches for drainage. Builders used small metalling stones, often dark, igneous rock such as basalt, topped with fine gravel, all set over a heavy bottoming of large cobbles on a gravel bedding and edged with substantial curbs. Where the subsoil was firm and well drained, engineers reduced the cobble layer to the minimum needed to hold the camber. On softer ground, they either dug down to bedrock or floated the road mound on a raft of sand or gravel. The rear earthwork, known as the Vallum, was not part of the first blueprint for the frontier. It was added on the south side while wall building was still underway. The order to dig it came at the same time as, or soon after, the decision to set forts on the line, though the digging may have started before some of those forts were finished. Its course bends around Benwell, Halton Chesters, Burdaswald, and Castlesteads, crosses the site later occupied by Carrawburgh, bypasses Carverin entirely, and ends at Newcastle rather than at Wallsend. Engineers designed the Vallum as a broad, flat-bottomed ditch between two cleared strips and flanking mounds. The ditch usually measures a little over 5.5 meters across at the top, about 2 3/4 meters deep, and just over 2 meters wide at the base, with sides cut at roughly 60 degrees. On each side, a cleared berm, 9 to 12 meters wide, was raised into a turf-cased mound about 2 3/4 meters high to keep the banks tight and stable. Local surveyors adjusted the pattern to suit ground conditions, but taken together the southern mound, ditch, and northern mound create a barrier about 37 meters wide. Once this earthwork was in place, movement up to the wall from the south was funneled onto cobbled causeways opposite the forts. Debate continues about the Vallum's purpose. The most plausible reading is that it guarded the rear of the frontier against unrest within the province. In some stretches, it runs close behind the curtain. Elsewhere, it lies nearly a mile away. Yet the ditch itself is a serious obstacle, and the mounds force anyone crossing them to stand out on the skyline, giving sentries time to react before intruders ever reached the wall. The strip between wall and Vallum thus formed a tightly controlled military zone. By the late 2nd century, this control eased, which is clear from the civilian settlements known as veici that began to cluster outside fort gates. Small strongpoints were built so that their north face aligned with the curtain. These were the Milecastles, which pierced the wall with arched gateways front and back, and carried a tower over the northern portal. They were of stone construction, even in the turf sector where the original rampart had been of sod, and they were placed at intervals of 1 Roman mile, regardless of the terrain. Each followed a standard plan with 1 or 2 long internal buildings. Judging by the space allotment used in barracks, they housed somewhere between 8 and 32 men. A bread oven usually stood in the northwest corner, and a stair in the northeast corner climbed to the rampart walk and the tower above the north gate. The series is numbered from east to west, starting at Wallsend and ending at Bonus on Solway. Between successive Milecastles, the army sank 2 evenly spaced turrets into the thickness of the wall, each roughly 6 meters square. These watchtowers were built together with the curtain's foundations, in stone even where the curtain itself was turf, and were meant for short-term occupation by very small teams, probably no more than 8 men. They almost certainly stood higher than the curtain. A height near 9.5 meters is a reasonable estimate. Their job was observation and signaling along the line. A door in the south wall gave entry. A central hearth provided warmth and cooking, and a ladder led to the upper floor and the roof. Although little of the superstructure survives, each turret could see the next, giving mutual support and unbroken surveillance. Turrets are counted in the same east-to-west sequence as the Milecastles. The original manning plan put garrisons in the older Staingate forts, some as much as 2 miles south of the line. While work proceeded, that plan changed and new forts were planted directly on the wall wherever ground allowed. In several places, the foundations of Milecastles and turrets already started were simply overbuilt by these forts, as at Milecastle 45 at Great Chesters and at Turrets 27A at Chesters, 36B at Housesteads, and 49 west of Bourdeswald. Counting South Shields, Newcastle, and Carverin, there were 17 forts on or very near the wall. 12 were in the first scheme, spaced so that an infantry column could march from one to the next in half a day, roughly 7 miles. 2 more were added later at Carraburg and Drumburg, and Carverin was rebuilt in stone near the end of Hadrian's reign. Carverin, along with Carlisle, Chesterholm, and Corbridge, remained from the earlier Staingate line. Fort defenses were built to exploit hand-thrown missiles, especially the heavy throwing spear. Effective ranges for such javelins are around 25 to 30 meters. Modern trials by an untrained thrower standing on the rebuilt West Gate and adjacent wall at South Shields have reached 15 to 20 meters. A fort was usually ringed by at least one V-shaped ditch, about 5.5 meters across at the top and nearly 3 meters deep. Inside that stood a mid-height stone curtain between about 1.25 and 1.5 meters thick and roughly 3.5 to 4.5 meters thick, 0.5 meters high to the walkway, with a narrower battlement above to cover sentries. Interval towers punctuated the circuit. A backing bank of earth and rubble, or turf with clay, buttressed the wall, and let men climb to the rampart walk anywhere in an emergency. Bread ovens were set into this bank, so cooking fires sat away from the main buildings and lowered the risk of accidental blaze. Just inside the rampart, at the lowest corner, where several drains could be brought together, sat the latrine block. The example at Housesteads, which could seat roughly 16 men, shows the system clearly. Although none of its seats remains, better preserved sites show rows made of wood or stone. The practical choice here is wood, set as a long bench with repeated keyhole-shaped openings. There was no provision for privacy, and the overall space looks small for a garrison of 800 men. Yet the drainage and flushing design is efficient. A perimeter road ran around the inside of the rampart. 4 fortified gateways pierced the circuit, each with double leaves. Forts straddling the wall often had 3 gates opening north, while those that used the wall itself as the northern rampart had only a single northern gate. External approach roads and internal streets lined up with these portals and with the principal buildings. Inside, the plan fell into 3 bands: a central strip for the command complex, with forward and rear zones for accommodation and work. Every fort, like a legionary base, centered on the headquarters building, which faced the main cross street. Always built in stone, this complex was both administrative hub and religious heart. It wrapped a paved courtyard on 3 sides with a colonnade and covered walkways. On the 4th side, opposite the entrance, stood an aisled hall where the commander's dais stood for routine business and discipline. Behind the hall lay a suite of 5 rooms. The middle room housed the shrine that held the imperial images, the altars, and the unit standards. Beneath it, a small vaulted strong room guarded the iron-bound chest containing the soldiers' savings, and sentries watched over both chest and standards at all times. The 2 rooms on the left belonged to the standard bearers and their clerks, who kept accounts and issued pay. The pair on the right belonged to the chief clerk and his staff, where the paperwork of the unit was done. Low stone screens with metal grills fronted the 3 central rooms so that men could see the sacred objects and speak with clerks without crossing the thresholds. On one side of the headquarters stood the commander's residence, a courtyard house with its own baths and underfloor heating, very like a compact Mediterranean villa. Here the officer lived with his family and household staff in relative comfort. Also in the central strip, close to one of the side gates for ease of access, stood the granaries, usually built as a pair. These stored the garrison's grain and other rations. Tacitus notes that forts in Britain held enough supplies for a full year, a claim borne out by excavation. Stone granaries are easy to spot by their raised floors carried on low walls or piers, the ventilation channels beneath, the buttressed outer walls, and the loading platforms. Many forts also housed hospitals. The usual plan sets small wards around a central corridor, with a reception area and a space where operations could be performed. The forward and rear zones held the living and working buildings, long barracks, stables for draft and pack animals, and workshops for smiths and armorers. Barracks that housed an infantry century or a cavalry troop were often half-timbered structures with low sandstone rubble walls bonded with clay and carrying timber uprights and infill of wattle and daub. Roofs were of wooden shingles or thatch. The typical block was an L-shaped structure about 10 meters wide and 40 to 50 meters long. It was divided into 10 two-room units for ordinary soldiers and a larger apartment at the foot of the L for the century's centurion or the cavalry troops officer. A veranda ran along the front, often facing another across a drainage channel. Officers' quarters were roomy and fitted with hearths, washing places and latrines, with timber-lined drains leading to a rubble-filled soakaway outside. Small pits cut beneath floors likely held wooden chests for documents and valuables. These suites may have housed not just the senior officer and his servants, but also junior officers under his command. In infantry barracks, each 8-man squad shared one 2-room unit. The outer room was the store for weapons, kit, and personal goods. The inner room was the sleeping space, where men lay on palliases. In cavalry barracks, the same 2-room module held 3 troopers and their mounts, with the outer room used as the stable and the inner as the sleeping and living space. Many inner rooms contained small hearths made from stone or tile with a semicircular flue, and elsewhere portable braziers likely provided heat and simple cooking. Floors were usually compacted earth or clay mixed with tile fragments. Small underfloor pits in both outer and inner rooms held wooden boxes for personal belongings, the same practical storage seen in officers' suites. Hadrian's wall had to cross 3 large rivers and several small ones. The minor streams posed little difficulty and were taken through the wall on broad culverts sized to carry full winter floods. Archaeology shows that bridges carried the wall over the Irthing and the North Tyne, though the structure over the Eden near Carlisle remains obscure. Because the channels at Chesters and Willowford later shifted, the abutments of both crossings still stand out. At Chesters, a modest early bridge of 8 hexagonal stone piers was rebuilt in the early 3rd century into a far more massive structure on 3 great piers with pointed cutwaters. Willowford's bridge was similarly rebuilt. North of the wall lay a string of outpost forts at Bewcastle, Netherby, and Burns, later joined by Risingham and High Rochester near Dare Street. The first 3 were turf and timber works, and almost certainly formed part of the original scheme, as a road ran north from Milecastle 50 at High House to Bewcastle. When the army returned to Hadrian's Wall after abandoning the Antonine line, these outposts were reoccupied, and the 2 eastern sites were added. Troops here watched local movements and relayed intelligence to the wall garrisons, but their larger purpose was to secure territory, probably Brigantian, cut off from the rest of the province by the new frontier. The Brigantes, whom Tacitus called the most numerous people in Britain, held much of what is now northern England, with their political heart in the Vale of York. Although the wall ended at Bonus on Solway, military control ran down the Cumbrian shore for roughly 26 Roman miles, about 24 modern miles, to Maryport. This coastal line used fortlets and watchtowers, and 5 turf and timber forts at Beckfoot, Maryport, Borough Walls, Moresby, and Ravenglass. There was no stone curtain or rear earthwork. The sea itself served as barrier and boundary. As on the wall proper, fortlets stood a Roman mile apart, and towers at every 1/3 of a mile. The towers were built in stone from the start, the fortlets in turf and timber, and unlike the wall Milecastles, these coastal mile fortlets were never rebuilt in stone. The system seems to have continued beyond Maryport, and may have reached St. Bees Head to control crossings of the Solway Firth. It was not manned again after the army withdrew from the Antonine frontier. The decision to abandon it reflects a judgment that the Western security threat had been overestimated. Clues to the order of building the wall include filled stretches of the ditch, sections of curtain, Milecastles and turrets dismantled to make room for forts, the change from broad to narrow stone gauge, the eastward extension to Wall's End, and the way the Vallum swings around certain forts. These details yield a sequence of decisions, though not exact dates. Firm dating comes from the governor Aulus Platorius Nepos, Hadrian's friend, and the man entrusted with the project. He arrived shortly before July 17th in the year 122, as shown by a discharge diploma issued by his predecessor, Quintus Pompeius Falco, that names Nepos as governor. He came from Lower Germany, the same region from which Hadrian set out for Britain in 122. Nepos is still attested in Britain in 124, but was likely gone by mid-127, since Lucius Trebius Germanus appears as governor on a diploma of the 20th of August that year. Inscriptions from Milecastles 37 at Housesteads, 38 at Hotbank, and 42 at Caulfields, and a wooden plaque from Milecastle 50 at High House carry his name for the initial phase. For the revised plan, his name appears on stones from the forts at Benwell, Holtonchesters, and Chesterholm. He is the only governor named on wall inscriptions. The sequence is clear. Hadrian toured Britain in 122, decided on the Tyne to Solway line, summoned Nepos from the Rhine frontier, and set him in charge. The 3 legions in Britain were broken into work parties, and construction began that same year. While work was underway, plans changed to place forts on the line and to add the Vallum. Each year offered an effective building season from April to October. Turf in winter lacks strength, and frost prevents mortar from setting. Frontinus advised limiting aqueduct construction to the same span because frost ruins curing mortar. Digging trenches and ditches in frozen ground also slows to a crawl. Precise work rates are hard to judge because the size and makeup of the workforce are unknown, as are the daily schedule and rest cycles. Experimental work gives a sense of the scale. In 1966, Royal Engineers reconstructed at Baginton a turf-revetted rampart 5.5 meters wide at the base and 3.5 meters high to the walkway. To complete a full circuit of about 283 meters with 1/3 earth fill required an estimated 138,000 standard turf blocks. With 210 to 300 men working 10-hour days in fair weather, the rampart and a double ditch could be finished in 9 to 12 days. Tests by the Royal School of Military Engineering suggest that 100 meters of military road would take about 40 man-hours to build across grassland, about 450 across heath, and about 600 across forest, assuming legionaries achieved 95% of a modern soldier's productivity. Building the full-scale replica of the broad-gauge wall at Chesterholm made plain how much muscle and material a frontier like Hadrian's demanded. Even a 14-meter run of curtain with a turret sized to match turret 26B at Brunton consumed roughly 400 tons of stone, and mixing the mortar drank about 3,637 liters of water per day. The job list was endless. Quarrying and roughly dressing facing blocks, gathering rubble for the core, burning lime and hauling water to slake it, cutting timber for scaffolds, and carting everything to the line. Most supplies could be sourced nearby across the Tyne-Solway Isthmus, though essentials like iron and lead for clamps, nails, and fittings came from elsewhere in Britain. The stone curtain was faced mainly in limestone and, taken across the whole project, would have required something on the order of 3.7 million tons of it. In the central Whinsill country, limestone was close to hand. The underlying basalt was usually too hard to dress into regular courses, though big basal stones were sometimes basalt. When the western turf wall was rebuilt in stone, builders used local limestone for the first 7 Roman miles, and then switched to the softer red sandstone available farther west. In the east, some limestone came from nearby quarries, and the rest was shipped up the Tyne. To save haulage, masons probably knocked off waste at the quarry and sent roughly squared blocks to site. The curtain's core was a quick but vulnerable mix, mostly stone with a quarter clay, the clay dug conveniently from the new ditch on the north side. Only the Milecastles got lime mortar in their cores at first. Ancient builders knew the risk of internal slumping in rubble and clay cores, and where the curtain later failed, the rebuilds were set almost entirely in mortar. Lime for mortar began as limestone lumps burned with charcoal in clamp or pot kilns for 2 to 3 weeks, then mixed with sand and water. A good mix used 2 parts, river sand to 1 part lime, or 3 parts pit sand to 1 part lime. Properly made, the mortar cured hard and stood up to weather and frost. Kiln remains dot both sides of the later military way, and tablets from Chesterholm even mention lime burning there. Water to slake lime, mix mortar, and puddle clay came from the Tyne, the Irthing, the Eden, and their tributaries. If hauled in barrels, it meant constant wagon traffic and heavy labor just to keep mixers wet. Timber was abundant then, especially in river bottoms and low ground. The army favored durable oak, but alder, birch, elm, and hazel were all pressed into service. Willow was ideal for the woven hurdles in wattle and daub walls. Alder and birch worked too. The workforce drew on detachments from all 3 British legions, the 2nd Augusta from Caerleon, the 6th Victrix loyal and faithful from York, and the 20th Valeria Victrix from Chester, with help from the British fleet. A legion's roster included the full spectrum of trades: surveyors, ditchers, designers, glaziers, tile makers, plumbers, stonecutters, lime burners, and woodcutters. The hardest part was not laying stone, but organizing the enterprise. Within each legion, the camp prefect, normally a former chief centurion and the 3rd officer, ran construction. The wall, its small installations, and the Cumbrian coastal works were planned together and split among legion work parties. Each legion took a stretch about 5 to 6 Roman miles long on both stone and turf sectors, then broke that into shorter jobs assigned to individual centuries under their centurions. Training manuals describe centurions checking progress with 10-foot measuring rods to be sure no squad skimped its share or drifted offline. Generally, the army raised Milecastles and turrets first, then pushed on with curtain foundations and ditch digging. Before any of that came the quiet work: setting out, clearing and leveling the line, and stockpiling materials. When a gang finished its task, they set a builder's stone into the work to record it. Surviving inscriptions preserve dozens of these credits. One stone at Carraburg notes that a century under a centurion named Thrupo built 24 paces of the rampart. A plaque from the turf Milecastle at High House records that the 7th cohort of the 2nd Legion Augusta was at work there under its officer. Another marker south of the old wall Milecastle reads in plain terms, "The 4th cohort of Lingonians built this." That auxiliary unit was raised in Upper Germany around Langres, is in Britain by the year 103, and is later attested at Wallsend for much of the 3rd century, and again around the turn of the 5th. It is a fair inference that routine digging and hauling often fell to auxiliaries while legionaries handled more technical tasks. Even so, you cannot match specific wall variants to specific legions with confidence. All the named stones so far come from sectors where plans were interrupted to plant forts on the line. At Housesteads, for instance, the north gateway of the Milecastle was abandoned before its arch imposts were set. And at Caulfields, the north wall narrows abruptly beyond side walls that, unusually, are not bonded into it. Because builders' stones were fixed over gateways, one legion may have started a structure, and another finished it. An inscription naming the 2nd Legion at a given Milecastle does not prove they laid the first courses there. Logistics dwarfed masonry. Organizers of the Chesterholm replica estimated that for every 10 men setting stones or digging, 90 more were needed to feed them with raw materials. Local civilians likely hauled and heaved alongside military teams. If the whole frontier took 5 seasons, delivering supplies would have meant something like 30,000 wagon trips with drivers, nearly 6,000 oxen, and more than 14,000 mules or horses. On the line itself, most loads moved by hand, which is exactly how the work crews are shown on Trajan's column. The replica team also cut a forward ditch and promptly learned it was the most punishing job of all, especially in boulder clay. In dry spells, the clay set like rock. In wet weather, it turned to putty. Once the trench was a few meters deep, rain and groundwater seeped constantly and had to be baled before any spade could bite. A ditch 12 meters wide and 3 meters deep demanded triple shoveling. One man heaved spoil to mid-slope, another tossed it to the lip, a third spread it along the glacis. Every so often they hit glacial boulders that could weigh up to a ton. Sandstone could be split and moved with effort. Basalt fought every inch. Roman Britain makes the most sense when viewed alongside the rest of the empire, and the Tyne-Solway frontier expresses the logic of Hadrian's wider policy. Trajan had sought peace and stability through expansion, believing that annexation and the ability to police old enemies would secure the borders. By the end of his reign, he was trying to finish and hold new conquests in the east, steady his gains in Dacia, and maintain the line elsewhere, all with a limited pool of troops. Hadrian also wanted stable frontiers, but unlike Trajan, he pursued security by drawing clear, visible boundaries that separated Romans from their neighbors. His visit to Britain shows this shift in action, not less energetic than Trajan's approach, but different in form. The wall was first conceived as an enhancement to the earlier Steingate line. In that opening plan, the main garrisons and police forces stayed in the existing forts, while the new barrier added control points. Milecastles were essentially fortified gateways, and with the turrets, they were meant to observe and regulate movement in both directions using small detachments. There is a puzzle, though. Most Milecastles lack built causeways across the ditch in front of their north gates. Without timber bridges, this sits awkwardly beside the sheer number of gateways, which points to an open crossing regime. The earthworks suggest a closed barrier. The architecture suggests controlled permeability. To make surveillance effective, the frontier needed commanding views. The Steingate sat low in the valleys of the Tyne, Irthing, and Eden, which limited sight lines. The wall was therefore pushed onto the northern crests of those valleys to take the high ground. In the central sector it rides the Whin Sill, a basalt escarpment of north-facing crags. In the east, it follows the north rim of Tynedale. In the west, it keeps to the north side of the Irthing Valley. The first blueprint, then, was a continuous barrier from Newcastle to Bowness-on-Solway, with a small fort every Roman mile and 2 watchtowers between each pair. What was built diverged from that plan. The opening scheme separated 2 functions: defense by the Steingate forts and border control by the Milecastles and turrets. In the revised scheme, both defense and control shifted onto the wall line itself. That is how the Tyne-Solway system evolved while construction was still underway. The wall was a barrier, not a fighting platform. Even on the broadest build, the walk was only about 2 meters wide once a parapet was allowed for, too tight for men to pass freely. Reinforcements could only move up through Milecastles and turrets spaced roughly half a kilometer apart, reached by narrow stairs. There were no salient towers to deliver flanking fire, and no positions for artillery. Roman doctrine was to meet the enemy in the open, using walls as a last refuge. Planting forts on the line improved supervision, tightened observation, and let patrols range more effectively to the north. Fresh fighting in the mid-120s likely drove the decision to embed forts in the curtain. Threat perception is the key to understanding how the wall worked, and the northern tribes were not always as quiet as once assumed. The later 2nd and early 3rd centuries saw repeated disturbances. In the first year of Marcus Aurelius, war threatened in Britain, and Calpurnius Agricola was sent north. A decade later, the Britons were again close to war. Within a few years, the Antonine frontier was abandoned and Hadrian's wall fully reoccupied, the historian Cassius Dio calling it the cross wall that splits the island in two. Commodus's reign opened with a major incursion in which tribes crossed the barrier, did heavy damage, and killed a general with his men. Burn layers around the year 180 at Haltonchesters, nearby Rudchester, and at Corbridge just to the south point to Hadrian's wall as the frontier that was crossed. If so, raiders came down Dare Street, wrecking sites along their route. How far they reached is unknown, but the slain commander was senior, perhaps the legion's legate at York. A burial at Ambleside records a retired centurion and an accounts clerk, likely father and son, the younger killed in the fort. Inscriptions from the same period show punitive expeditions beyond the wall. A legionary legate erected an altar near Stanwix to thank the gods for success north of the frontier. A cavalry prefect at Corbridge dedicated an altar after his unit cut down a warband called the Corrionototai, likely a branch of the Brigantes. In 197, weakened by civil war, the governor Virius Lupus did not have the strength to strike the Maiatai and Caledoni, and instead bought peace with a heavy payment. His successor a decade later reported victories, yet after the emperor Septimius Severus campaigned in person, both the Maiatai and the Caledoni were again in revolt. Events on the northern line rose and fell with imperial politics elsewhere, and with the temper of the tribes on either side of the barrier. The wall was held by auxiliaries rather than legions. By completion, perhaps a third of all auxiliary troops in Britain, around 9,000 men, were stationed along the Tyne-Solway line. The distinction mattered. A legionary was a Roman citizen. An auxiliary soldier was a non-citizen who, after 25 years of service, could receive citizenship and formal marriage rights so that his children would be citizens. The promise was recorded on a bronze discharge diploma. Recruits had to prove free birth and pass a medical. The ideal age was 18 to 23. Though Britain's oldest known auxiliary recruit joined at 30 in the 4th cohort of Gauls. Despite their lack of citizenship, auxiliary troops were not second-rate. They garrisoned the frontier and often stood in the front line in pitched battle. Units drew heavily from warlike peoples within or near Roman control, especially from northern Gaul, the German provinces on the lower Rhine, and Pannonia. The second cohort of Tungrians, for example, was first raised among the Tungri, who lived on the northwestern edge of the Ardennes. Under the early emperors, such units might be stationed near their homelands. But after the mutinies of 69 to 70 on the Rhine, the army stopped keeping strongly ethnic units close to home. Local recruiting continued to top up numbers, and units retained their traditional names and identities even as more of their men were drawn from where they served. One gravestone tells of Sextus Valerius Genialis, a citizen trooper in the first wing of Thracians who called himself a Frisian tribesman. He was from the lower Rhine, served in a Thracian cavalry unit in Britain, and identified as Roman. Auxiliary formations came in three main types. Cavalry wings were all horse units. Infantry cohorts were all foot. Mixed cohorts combined both arms. All were built on the infantry century, commanded by a centurion, and the 32-man cavalry troop commanded by a decurion. An infantry cohort could be about 500 strong, with 6 centuries under a prefect, or about 1,000 strong with 10 centuries under a tribune. A mixed cohort could be about 500 strong with 6 centuries and 4 troops under a prefect, or about 1,000 strong with 10 centuries and 8 troops under a tribune. A cavalry wing could field 16 troops, about 500 riders, or 24 troops, about 770 riders, under a prefect of cavalry. Like the legions, auxiliaries carried numbers and names and collected honors for bravery and loyalty. Western units were usually named for a tribe or region, Eastern units for a city. Over time, their titles recorded deeds and rewards. One Gallic and Thracian cavalry wing took its honorific Classiana from its first commander, a Gallic noble named Julius Classianus. It later added Invincible and twice awarded the Torque, and at one point received a mass grant of citizenship for all men, then serving as a reward for valor in battle, after which the unit styled itself of Roman citizens. The torques were bestowed on the unit rather than on individuals and were carried on its standards. Subsequent recruits remained non-citizens until honorable discharge, but the unit's proud titles told the story of its service. On paper, the ground plan of a fort ought to reveal the size and type of the auxiliary unit stationed there. In practice, counting barrack blocks does not always map cleanly to a single regiment, because the tidy model of one unit to one fort was often ignored. The original garrisons of many wall forts are therefore uncertain. By contrast, 3rd century garrisons are frequently named on stones and altars, and the overall mix they show is probably close to what stood there in the 2nd century as well. To place units in space and time, historians lean first on dated inscriptions. Where none survive, a posting is sometimes inferred from context, such as a repair text or a dedication by soldiers who may not actually have been the resident garrison. Lead seals stamped with unit names only prove who shipped a batch of goods, not who was camped on that site. Discharge diplomas are firmer evidence, since they list units present in Britain on the day they were issued. A late imperial roll, known as the Notitia Dignitatum, compiled around the turn of the 5th century, names many frontier units in their forts, and a striking number match postings first attested in the early 3rd century. Cavalry were strongly represented. The only 1,000-strong cavalry wing in Britain stood at Stanwix, and 2 500-strong wings held Benwell and Chester's. Additional wings at Old Carlisle and Chesterless Street sat within quick reach of the wall. Their placement hugged the 2 main roads north of the barrier, Deer Street at the Port Gate near Corbridge and the Annandale route at Stanwix. 3 infantry-only cohorts held the central belt farthest from those roads at Housesteads, Great Chesters, and Burdiswald. Most of the remaining garrisons were mixed cohorts of foot and horse. It is misleading to call the mounted element of a mixed cohort mounted infantry. On the march and in battle, they operated with the cavalry wings and were classed as cavalry, albeit second line compared with the pure wings. On a frontier, they extended the reach of patrols and police work. Only 7,000-strong cohorts are known in Britain, and they cluster in the wall zone, likely to offset the distance to the legions. 5 of the 7 were mixed units with cavalry. 500-strong cohorts appear less often on the wall in both 2nd and 3rd centuries. Roughly half of the 49 such cohorts served on the wall at some point, while only about a quarter of the wings did so. Of those 49 cohorts, a little over half were mixed, and about half of that mixed group saw wall service. The Roman army generated reams of paperwork as rolls and reports from Egypt, Libya, and the Euphrates frontier show. Unofficial letters add a soldier's eye view. One brief note sent to a man at Chesterholm lists a pair of socks, 2 pairs of sandals, and 2 pairs of underpants, then sends greetings to his messmates, including a comrade with the Greek name Elpis, and wishes the whole barrack room good fortune. The sender was likely a relative or close friend, bundling home comforts that were not standard issue but were widely worn. The letter also shows how quickly auxiliary soldiers became literate and adopted Latin, which many did not speak before enlistment. Private letters paint a familiar picture of pride and frustration. They record dodged duties and promotions won, hopes and illnesses, family worries, the generosity of gifts and the pinch of asking for cash, and side businesses both inside and outside the ramparts. A typical day shows up clearly in unit reports. Men are marked present and correct for training, parade, and inspection, then rotated through routine chores, standing guard at headquarters, at granaries, and at gates, scrubbing a centurion's gear, cleaning baths and latrines, and sweeping streets. Duty rosters from a 1,000-strong mixed cohort at Dura Europos show that up to a quarter of the unit could be on guard on any given day. Each soldier also cleaned his own arms and armor, collected firewood for his cooking, and gathered fodder for the baggage animals. When a man broke the monotony with a supply party, an escort run, or a temporary posting to another unit, his absence and his return were logged if he was away more than a day. A strength report from Chesterholm around the year 90 gives a sharp snapshot. 296 men were on site, 31 of them unfit for duty, and 456 were away. Of those absent, 337 were at Corbridge, 46 were on the governor's guard, 1 centurion was in London, and small detachments of 6, 9, 11, and 45 were scattered to 4 other places. The total, 752, sits close to the nominal 800 for a 1,000-strong infantry cohort on paper. Food rarely sparked mutiny, which suggests the average soldier ate as well as, and often better than, civilians of similar means. Even auxiliaries in remote forts had varied diets. In the field, the basics were bacon fat, hard biscuits, salt, sour wine, and wheat. The grain was ground by hand and turned into flatbread, porridge, or pasta. Meat and cheese were added when they could be found. Inside forts, wheat still anchored the diet, but herds on fort land, hunted game, purchases, and requisitions expanded the menu. Milk and cheese came from unit livestock as well as markets. Local fruit and vegetables rounded out meals. Analysis of sewage at Bearsden on the Antonine frontier shows a high-fiber, largely plant-based diet with meat also present. Wheat and barley appear alongside beans, fig, dill, coriander, poppy seeds likely sprinkled on bread, hazelnut, raspberry, bramble, strawberry, bilberry, and celery. Fig, dill, coriander, and celery seeds were Mediterranean imports and sometimes used as medicines. The same samples show whipworm and roundworm and weevils in some grain. Animal bones from forts in Britain and Germany prove a taste for ox, sheep, and pig, with goat, red and roe deer, wild boar, hare, domestic fowl and wild birds, fish, and shellfish also eaten. Other fruit included apples, pears, plums, cherries, peaches, grapes, elderberries, damsons, apricots, olives, and pomegranates, with nuts such as sweet chestnut, walnut, and beech. Writing tablets from Chesterholm mention cabbage, garden peas, broad and horse beans, carrots, radishes, garlic, plus pulses such as lentils and chickpeas. Eggs, salt, spices, and vinegar should be added to the list. Soldiers drank wines of mixed quality and local beer, honey-sweetened food, and fish sauce known as muria, much like modern Southeast Asian fish sauces, flavored countless dishes. One amphora from Chesterholm once held such sauce. 2 meals anchored the day, a midday lunch called prandium and an evening supper called cena. In theory, rations were issued daily and cooked by the men themselves, since there were no central kitchens. A bronze grain measure from Carverin holds enough wheat for 7 daily issues, which implies weekly distribution. Because 8 men slept and lived in a single room or under the same tent, they almost certainly pooled rations and rotated the cooking. Cooking gear and millstones marked with barrack room names confirm that the contubernium functioned as a mess. Ancient writers describe food eaten communally by these 8-man squads, with roasting and boiling as the standard methods. Each soldier was expected to have a mess tin, a kettle for the fire, and a roasting spit as part of his kit. Ancient handbooks describe the emergency rations a soldier carried on campaign, which included sour wine known as acetum. Mixed with water, it became posca, a sharp, refreshing drink. Graffiti on wine amphorae found at military sites show the army's tastes went beyond acetum. The richest cache comes from the 1st century fortress at Vindonissa in Upper Germany, where jars were marked with very mature wine from Sorrento in southern Italy, wine from Messina in Sicily, and an aged blend that seems to have been infused with fruit. Other containers mention imports from southern Gaul and the Iberian Peninsula. Finds in Britain echo this picture. An ink note on a jar from the wine cellar at the Richborough supply base names wine from Mount Vesuvius. A handle from Newstead is scratched with the word for vintage wine, and amphorae at Mumrills and Wallsend record sweet wine and wine sweetened with honey. Beer was clearly popular as well, which fits the Celtic and Germanic backgrounds of many auxiliary soldiers. One inscription speaks of a discharged sailor from the German fleet who set up to supply local beer to garrisons on the Lower Rhine late in the 1st century. On northern British sites, large amounts of barley turn up. Literary sources say barley could be doled out as animal feed or as punishment rations, yet tablets from Chesterholm show a steady demand for brewing. One weekly account lists more than 46 liters of wine, including a high-grade Italian Massic, a supply of sour wine, 69 liters of Celtic beer, and 187 liters of barley. Another letter mentions roughly 1,715 liters of threshed grain known to be used in Celtic beer. A brewer named Atrectus appears in the same archive, which strongly hints that beer was being made on or near the fort. A decurion named Masclus even added a plea to his commander that his men had no beer and needed a delivery. He had been sent out to collect winter wheat for the garrison, likely from Corbridge, and the detachment plainly missed its comforts while away from base. Legionary forts usually placed their bathhouses inside the walls, but auxiliary forts tended to build them outside. Along Hadrian's wall, these buildings follow a familiar pattern. They are compact blocks of 4 or 5 stone rooms with cold, warm, and hot chambers, plus a latrine. Bathers moved from the cold room into progressively hotter spaces, then retraced their steps to the cold room and finished with a dousing to close the pores before dressing. The floor sat on stacks of small pillars to create a crawl space for underfloor heat, and furnaces pushed hot air through this hypocaust and up the walls through clay box flues. For soldiers, the baths were as much club as hygiene. Excavations in northern Britain show men lingering in the warm changing rooms, with mugs of imported wine or local beer, playing dice and board games, and snacking on shellfish. Supplies of mussels and oysters are recorded at Bar Hill, Benwell, Chesters, Corbridge, High Rochester, Maryport, Mumrells, Newstead, Rudchester, and South Shields. Oysters were even stacked in the Richborough wine cellar. Roman writers remark on Richborough's beds, which suggests the army in Britain had its own shellfish source. Gambling is certain. An altar set against the changing room wall of the bathhouse at Balmildy on the Antonine frontier was dedicated to fortune by a tribune of an auxiliary unit, and gaming counters and parts of a board lay nearby. A ceramic game board and 3 dice turned up at the 20th Legion's Works Depot at Holt, likely for a game called 12 Points. An ancestor of backgammon played on a board of 3 by 12 points with 15 counters per player and 3 dice. Poets describe boards incised with rows representing the months and praise players who could recite every throw and move after a long match. Counters were usually bone discs, often in contrasting colors. Some boards are lettered rather than numbered and spell out witty phrases about luck, gambling, or soldiering, which fits their likely use in garrisons. Another favorite was the soldiers' game of robbers, a battleboard contest where pieces moved like a rook in chess and were captured by being trapped between 2 enemies in a row or a column. Writers trace it back to a Greek pebble game with Egyptian roots. Pieces were of stone or glass in different colors. Boards varied in size, though 8 by 8 squares seems common, and some sources imply large numbers of men in play at once. In Britain, these boards are carved into stone at the Chester Fortress, at Newstead, Burdiswald, Corbridge, and Wallsend, at Milecastles 40 and 50, at Turret 52 East, and at the Richborough Depot. The winner was the one who removed the most enemy pieces, and in a nice military touch, the victor could be hailed as commander, underlining the game's martial flavor. One poem even lays out tactics, praising tight phalanxes of pieces and the clever breaking of an opponent's line to wreak havoc behind it. Dice were everywhere. The Emperor Claudius loved them enough to write their history, and even played in his carriage on a special board that stopped the cubes from bouncing away. Soldiers followed suit. Bone dice with ring and dot faces from 1 to 6, indistinguishable from modern ones, come from many sites including Burdiswald. There is also a 4-sided type called knucklebones, made of antler at Burdiswald, with faces for 1, 3, 4, and 6 and 2 rounded blank sides, thrown 4 at a time. The best throw was called Vanus, and the worst was the dogs, 4 ones. In a version played by Augustus, anyone who threw dogs or a 6 had to put 4 silver coins into a pool, and the first to throw Venus took the lot. Frescoes from an inn at Pompeii show the classic scene of dice shaken in a cup and spilled onto the table. Military digs in Britain turn up many examples in bone or antler, and not all are fair, as shown by a loaded pair from Housesteads. Gambling chips accompany them, generally of bone and marked with numerals. Most carry simple marks for 10, 5, and 1, with some showing an extra stroke to indicate a silver coin. A few chips even carry the jaunty promise, "I will gladly repay," echoing a satirist's jibe that men now approached the gambling table not with purses, but with treasure chests. Ammianus Marcellinus says the elder Gratian, father of the Emperor Valentinian I, was so powerful and adept at wrestling in the soldier's style that he seemed a second Milo of Croton. Tacitus even describes a service rivalry that spiraled into disaster when a bout between a man from the 5th Aladi and a Gallic auxiliary turned ugly. The legionary was thrown, the auxiliary mocked him, and the crowd split along unit lines until legionaries and auxiliaries were trading blows, and 2 cohorts were effectively destroyed. Blood sports drew soldiers too, hunting above all for those who could afford it. Hadrian, during his early training, earned criticism for his zeal for the chase. Britain's frontier hills held boar, wolves, deer, and foxes in abundance. At Binchester, the cavalry commander Gaius Tetius Veturius Missianus thanked Silvanus, the unconquered woodland god, for finally bringing down an exceptional boar that had eluded earlier hunts, likely with some of his troopers driving the beat. The army also laid on entertainment. Gladiators and animal shows are hinted at in the literature, and amphitheaters on garrison sites make their popularity plain. Outside the Chester fortress stood an arena that could seat around 7,000, serving both the legion and the civilian settlement that clustered nearby. From Augustus down to Septimius Severus, a serving soldier, citizen or not, could not contract a legally recognized marriage. Roman society had many shades of union, but for the ranks, the hard edge of this rule was about the status of children and the transmission of citizenship, which is why discharge diplomas mattered so much. In practice, a man enlisted for 25 years chose companionship anyway. He formed unofficial households, and he also sought other outlets. A graffito from Dura Europos shows an optio arranging lodgings for mimes and actresses, the first offering stage shows, and the second more intimate diversions in what was effectively a camp brothel. At Carnuntum beside the Danube, a sprawling tavern and brothel complex catered to the fortress. Pompeian brothel walls preserve soldiers' boastful signatures, proof that off-duty men made these places part of their routine. Commanders worried about idleness rather than romance. Writers like Velleius Paterculus and Vegetius stress that too much leisure bred trouble, so officers cut down free time and kept men busy. Official leave did exist despite hard-line governors such as Galba, who was notorious for refusing passes. Papyrus files and the Vindolanda writing tablets preserve formal leave requests. One man from Chesterholm asked to go to nearby Corbridge. A duty list for the 3rd Cyrenaican Legion in the autumn of 87 shows 2 men away on leave. Another roster for the 20th Palmyrene cohort in 219 notes 2 who failed to return. The ideal painted by philosophers cast soldiers as shepherds, guarding the imperial flock. Yet many sources dwell on heavy-handed behavior. Juvenal, who once commanded the first cohort of Dalmatians in Britain, grouses about passers-by having their toes smashed by hobnailed boots and about beatings few dared to challenge. In Petronius's Satyricon, the hero, sword at his hip, is stopped at night by a soldier who questions his unit and then robs him when he falters. Egyptian petitions from civilians record robbery and extortion and carry the ring of lived experience. Even so, communities often clung to garrisons because regular pay meant regular demand. Traders profited by feeding the men, pouring their drinks, and meeting their other appetites, even if it brought risk. Life just outside the ramparts made that symbiosis visible. The vicis that grew up around forts offered shops, taverns, and gaming houses a few steps from the gate. Hadrian, tightening discipline, tried to cap the number of such establishments and curb the habit of going absent without leave. Moralists complained that the Syrian army spent more time in beer gardens and theaters than on drill. Corbulo found that command undisciplined marched it into Armenia's highlands and restored standards the hard way, and Vespasian later had to do the same. Excavations along Hadrian's Wall confirm the pull of these settlements, where soldiers ate, drank, gambled, and above all, met local women. Many of those relationships produced children. A list from near Alexandria, in 194 names, 46 veterans of the Second Trajanic Legion. Of the 41 whose origins are given, 32 were Egyptian, and 24 say they were born in camp, a strong hint that many were the sons of soldiers and local partners rather than products of legal marriages.